Shove it, man!
Shove It Squad. The Hawk isn't a massive fan of list type videos, purely because I feel like they've all been done to death. But occasionally I'll stumble upon an idea and a quick search on YouTube will reveal that nobody else has made the video, and then I'm good to go. Like a punch to the gut, you're gonna know. One of the most hated major storylines in wrestling history is the Invasion storyline. It wasn't necessarily that it was bad, it was more of a case of missed potential. People wanted to see dream matches between the WWF and the WCW, and people also wanted to see ECW as a standalone faction. Despite the amount of money left on the table and not getting the dream matches we wanted, Little Hawk was still a fan of the storyline because I wasn't really aware of the misfiring storyline at the time. To me it felt like a real invasion where anybody could just turn up and crazy stuff was happening every week. And JR and Paul Heyman on commentary were gold. They really sold me on the threat of the WCW-ECW alliance and made me believe. There was suddenly what felt like hundreds of wrestlers in the WWF. But did you know there could have been even more? When the WWF purchased WCW, they took 24 contracts, but not all of those guys made much of a presence on WWF programming. There were also several WWF wrestlers on the injury list. In fact, they had a hell of an injury list at this time, so I won't be discussing the likes of Rikishi, Triple H, Val Venus, the Big Boss Man and Benoit, who all missed the entire storyline. Eddie Guerrero was in rehab and The Rock was off making movies. And then there were wrestlers who had fallen out with management but were still contracted. Today's video is not about wrestlers who WWF should have hired to use in the storyline. No, this is about wrestlers they already had under contract. So here is the top 11 because I couldn't narrow it down more, shut up or I'll smack you one. 11 wrestlers WWF could have used in the Invasion storyline to make it better, but didn't. Number 11, Steve Blackman. Blackman was a consistent on-screen character for the majority of the Attitude Era. It felt like he had a place when they had the likes of Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn. He was never exactly full of charisma, but we let it slide because it was so fun watching him beat people with nunchucks and potentially fighting with the other WWF wrestlers who were known to be legit fighters. But at the turn of the millennium, they were gone and Blackman became exposed. Creative started to poke fun at him and put him in the head cheese gimmick, a tag team with Al Snow that only seemed to exist to make fun of Blackman's lack of charisma. The hardcore division was the only other place he'd find a home at this time. Got a hardcore match? Just have Blackman interfere and try to take the belt from Crash Holly. The last roll of the dice was a tag team with Grandmaster Sexay, which I'm pretty sure no one remembers happening, but again this was only designed to poke fun at Blackman's lack of charisma. But Blackman was still under contract when the Invasion storyline started. Blackman was actually last seen on WWF programming the very night that the line was crossed, the night that Booker T and Shane McMahon attacked Vince McMahon in the ring. He was part of the crew that was about to run the WCW off, but I guess he went in the wrong direction and kept running because we never saw him again. He was off injured for a bit and spent the rest of 2001 down in Heartland Wrestling with the rest of the WWF stars they no longer wanted. He was back from injury before the Alliance storyline ended, which is why he's made this list, and he stayed off TV until his contract ended. Would Blackman have been a good addition to Team WWF during the Invasion storyline? I mean, he could have played a part of a good hard man as part of a mob led by the APA, but he never exactly had the character strength to play the leading part in a storyline. I'm not too sure about this one. What could he have done? You tell me. Number 10, R-Truth. Back then he was going as K-Quick. I'm reaching a little bit with this one, hence the low rating. He was used during the Invasion. Barely. Road Dogg, his partner, had been fired and Truth was in limbo. He was only seen as part of the backstage crowd at this point. He was a member of the mob. That's literally it. He was released during the Invasion angle. Now I've watched back the Truth's entire run as K-Quick, and let me tell you, he was severely underutilised. He showed up in TNA a year later and they just gave him a mic and let him speak. So he had the ability to be a breakout star. And he had a character completely different to anything else they had on the roster at the time. I'd have used him. Number 9, Lex Skipper. 24 contracts. That's how many WWF acquired along with the purchase of WCW. And a lot of these guys didn't even end up making it onto the programming. Skipper is one of those I'd like to focus on, as I think he could have been a cool addition. He was closely aligned with Lance Storm towards the end of WCW. Now picture this. Instead of Lance Storm hanging out and teaming with Mike Awesome, why not put him with Skipper? Wouldn't that have made a bit more sense? And it's not like there were many African Americans on the roster at the time. And come on, it's Lex Skipper. The guy had an excellent physique and could pull off some crazy moves in the ring. You can't tell me he wouldn't have made the Invasion more fun on the lower card. But no, he was just shoved down in Heartland Wrestling. And now's a good time to talk about it. It's time for a segment. Because I just love segments, it's time for yet another Taz Factoid.
I got a factoid for both you guys. I got a boil on my ass.
This is a good one, so clean your ears out and listen. Did you know that the Invasion storyline also ran down in Heartland Wrestling with a WCW faction trying to take over there? Not something that's often talked about. Number 8, Alan Funk. This isn't one that would massively improve the Invasion storyline, it's more of a nitpick. You had this guy, Shawn Stasiak, on the WCW side doing this stupid goofball gimmick, running into stuff and losing his matches, except he wasn't funny. It was funny once or twice, but it became a running joke throughout the Invasion storyline that he failed at everything. So my thinking here is why not put somebody in the role who was actually funny or used to wrestling a comedy style? Alan Funk was a versatile wrestler who played several roles, usually with a bit of a homosexual vibe to them. And that is something else that wasn't featured on the WWF programming until Billy and Chuck turned up. Funk could out-wrestle Stasiak, out-promo Stasiak, and he was a more versatile performer than Stasiak. As I said, just a small nitpick on that one. Number 7, S.A. Rios. Yeah, my favourite luchador of all time was still in the WWF during the Invasion. You'd have barely known it though. He was only seen as part of the backstage crew at this time. He hadn't had a match on Raw since February that year, so it wasn't exactly going well for him. Unless you're a real wrestling nerd, or a hawk, you wouldn't have known that S.A. Rios was still having regular matches on the C shows. And they were good. He even got a B on the Ring of the Hawk bricked, so you can shove that up Sonny Siaki's ass. So he had quality that could have helped their in-ring product on the main show. Unfortunately, his mic skills were appalling. But you know, let's see him face Rob Van Dam, that could have been sweet. His final match came in August as he failed to challenge and beat Chris Kanyon for the WCW US title. Number 6, Dio Brown. Things hadn't exactly been going well for the first Eurocontinental champion since the turn of the millennium. This was for 2 reasons. His friend and biggest fan backstage, Vince Russo, left the company, which certainly didn't help his push. He also paralysed Droz on a botched running powerbomb. Prior to this, a few saw D'Lo as a future heavyweight champion, and whilst the Hawk thinks that's going a little bit too far, he was certainly an excellent mid-carder. He was used less and less on WWF TV and ended up in a tag team with Chaz called Lowdown. It was kind of like a gimmick from the streets. They had a good rap song and good moves, but then things changed. It somehow became a religious gimmick. They put D'Lo in a turban and he had a manager called Tiger Ali Singh. This rubbish lasted 6 months and they barely made it onto the main show because nobody cared. A few months before the Invasion storyline started, both Chaz and Tiger Ali Singh were released from their contracts, but D'Lo remained under contract. He spent the entire Invasion sent off to Puerto Rico, where he teamed up with Shane Sewell. And then when he came back to the USA, he was sent to Heartland Wrestling, which was the WWF developmental territory. He didn't come back to Raw until spring 2002, which meant he missed the entire Invasion storyline. I think he could have been a cool addition. I'd have liked to see him wrestle RVD, Booker T and Billy Kidman. We saw in his TNA run that he still had a lot in his locker in terms of wrestling skill, and this could have maybe given his career a shot in the arm, because it sure needed it at this point. Number 5, Jerry Lynn. Lynn was hired by the WWF just after ECW went under, and this extremely skilled wrestler was in the WWF for most of the Invasion storyline, but I'd forgive you if you've forgotten that had happened. He held the WWF Light Heavyweight title for 2 months and made a sum total of 3 appearances on the main show, so Jerry Lynn in the WWE was easy to miss. This former ECW champion somehow had no association with the ECW Invasion. Why not? Jerry Lynn did pick up an injury around this time, but once he was cleared to wrestle, he asked them what his role was going to be in the Invasion storyline, but he was told there was no spot for him. He could have had some fantastic matches with the likes of Edge, Jericho and X-Pac and obviously RVD. Instead, WWF had Jerry Lynn in his prime and chose not to involve him in the storyline. Maybe it was his bad death metal gimmick that soured the WWF writers and they didn't want to use him. He was gone before the Invasion storyline even finished. You had Jerry Lynn in the prime of his career and you didn't use him. His second to last match was against RVD on a C show, and it's one of the better matches you'll ever see on a C show. But despite that, he was released before the storyline ended. Number 4, Chyna. Yeah, believe it or not, Chyna was still a contracted wrestler during the Invasion angle. Chyna's final WWF match took place at Judgment Day 2001, which was in May, and the Invasion storyline kicked off just 1 month after this. She had a big fallout with management and she was demanding a £1 million contract, with the WWF only willing to give her $400,000. This was a really bad time in Chyna's life. She just lost her sister and she still had the problems with Triple H going on. Now hear me out, she was obviously still able to compete in matches because she was offered a contract, and she also went off to Japan to wrestle a year later. Also, Triple H was off TV injured until 2002, so that wouldn't have been much of an issue. So Chyna could have featured in the Invasion storyline, she was available. And it's not as if the Ninth Wonder of the World wasn't popular. She certainly would have added some much needed star power to the company. I'm not sure what I would have done with her, but Billy Gunn, K-Quick and X-Pac weren't exactly doing anything important at this time. Maybe DX could have reformed and had a run as a separate group to the WWF or the Alliance. Number 3, Mark Henry. I know I've said it a lot, but it's easy to forget that Mark Henry was a contracted wrestler at this time. And this more than ever, seeing as he hadn't been seen on WWF programming since the spring of 2000. When the WWF originally signed the World's Strongest Man, they gave him a long contract. It was 10 years. They saw a lot of potential in him, but he wasn't living up to that potential when he was shoved down to Ohio Valley Wrestling, which was another developmental territory for the WWF. So he missed the entire Invasion angle because he sucked. Now hear me out on this one. I know he had no affiliation to the Alliance, but I think they could have touched on real life issues here. They could have brought Henry back to the main roster and turned him heel and had him turn his back on them. The reason would be that the Fed didn't want him and he was now back to prove them wrong and show them what they've missed out on. The Alliance didn't really have any monster heels, so this is a spot he could have slotted into quite well. I think Shane McMahon would have acted as a good mentor for him and a mid-card run would have been suitable. Now I know I said about the Alliance not having anyone playing the monster role, but I have someone who could have done it better that I'll feature later in this list. Number 2, Mike Sanders. Bear with me on this one. I know I featured Mike Sanders at number 2. I've not just drank a gallon of bleach. I know I call him beyond boring, but at this point it's more of a running joke. This whole channel is a running joke. Sanders was used in the WCW as a mouthpiece. He was the WCW commissioner and a leader for the Natural Born Thrillers, a collection of wrestlers who were built like beasts but had the charisma of a tube of toothpaste. Sean O'Hare excluded. I liked Sean. Vince probably saw potential in all of these big guys, but they all flopped massively in the WWF. Bring Mike Sanders with them and let him speak before their matches. It might help them get some heat and give them some direction. As it's been mentioned a million times, most of the WCW wrestlers that the WWF decided to push were younger guys who lacked charisma. Sanders is someone who could help with that. And something else I've been finding out lately is Sanders can actually go in the ring. His main drawback is that he doesn't look like much. But if you're stood in front of the Natural Born Thrillers, that becomes a positive because you stand out, you're different. I could have also seen Sanders feuding with William Regal over a commissioner role. Instead, he spent the entire Invasion in developmental and never wrestled more than a dark match on Heat. And number 1, Haku. This one seems like such an obvious choice. It's WWF versus WCW and he's a guy that is strongly associated with WCW. And they were lacking guys who made sense on their side of the storyline. Haku was known as Meng in WCW, but he was an extremely pointless hiring by the WWF in the year 2000. They barely used him, he didn't even manage 10 matches on the main roster. Like many people on this list, he spent the entire Invasion storyline on the C shows. But do you know what's even more ridiculous? He was on the side of the WWF, not WCW. Why? Yes, he was in the WWF in the early 90s, but nobody cares about that. Nobody remembers him for that. And do you know what else? The Alliance were missing a believable, unstoppable monster type of wrestler. Yes, he wasn't the greatest in the ring, but he could have been someone to strike fear into his opponents in a believable way. I would have definitely used him on the WCW side, and it would have been a chance for him to finally have something to do. Much like my earlier Mark Henry entry, but this one made more sense. But the writers had obviously been hit in the head with a brick and weren't thinking logically. What's even more mind-boggling is when Haku was sent down to developmental, he was now representing WCW in their little invasion that was going on down there. It was all inconsequential, but he did exist down there. He just didn't do anything, so what a waste. He would be gone from the WWF before the storyline even finished. And now this list is finished. Were you a fan of this storyline or did you hate it? And also let me know, who do you think should have been used and wasn't? This is not about people you think they should have hired, it's about using what they already had. And if you don't agree with that, I'll leave you without a dad.